I hope you will enjoy the development of Cairo, urban development of Cairo, as presented by Jarek. I leave you the floor.
Good evening. Welcome to the reception hall of our noble lord, the Sultan, the King, Al-Ashraf Abu Nasr Qaitbey, as Nasrahu. I will have to ask for your patience. Please bear with me because this will be a long talk. It is rather difficult to pack more than almost 1400 years of history into one presentation, so it will last. There will be things that I will have to leave out, there will be things that I will have to oversimplify, but I hope I will be able to give some overview. Now, we're talking about the urban development of Cairo. Cairo was established as the capital of Islamic Egypt. As many people tend to think about it, in year 639, an enormous army swarmed Egypt, invading from Arabia, and took over the country of the pharaohs with its pyramids and its temples. Well, the army of Amr ibn al-Aslan that invaded Egypt had 4,000 people, eventually grew to 12,000 people, which was not much compared to the population of the country, which is counted in millions. Egypt was a Christian country where the last temples of ancient Egyptian religion had closed about 100 years before. The last pharaoh had been dead for about 900 years. So what did the Arabs actually conquer? Since year 30 BC, Egypt was a province of the Roman Empire. At the empire's height, one could theoretically travel from eastern Turkey to Portugal or from Yorkshire to Morocco, paying with the same currency, subject to the same law, and doing official business in the same language. But by the time of Arab conquest, the empire had long been divided between the eastern and western parts, and by the end of the 5th century, the Western Empire had ceased to exist, and Europe descended into the chaos of the Dark Ages. Egypt was part of the Eastern Empire, where Christianity was the state religion. But the Egyptians never accepted the changes to the Christian creed established at the Council of Chalcedon in the mid-5th century. So they retained their own patriarch, their own church hierarchy, their own liturgy, their own language, and most of the Egyptians treated Byzantine administration and Byzantine church hierarchy as foreign occupiers and religious oppressors. When Arab conquered Egypt, it was a part of building and rapidly of a completely new world order. Within just over 100 years from the beginning of the Islamic era, one could again travel from Eastern Turkey or Afghanistan to Portugal or Spain, paying with the single currency, subject to the same law, and doing official business in the same language. Egypt was now a part of this completely new world order. At the time of the conquest, the capital of Egypt was, of course, Alexandria, but the Arabs quickly realized the strategic importance of the point where the Nile branches into the delta, which gives control both over the trade on the river as on the routes from east to west. We have to remember that at the time of the conquest, the course of the Nile was much farther east than it is now. And in general principle, Cairo developed from its original nucleus around the area of Old Cairo nowadays, and developed along the river northwards. And the sequence of great congregational mosques in Cairo illustrates it amply. Then, in the 12th century, a mighty citadel was built on the spur of Mukatab Hills over the city, and great Muslim cemeteries developed between the city and the desert plateau of the Mukatam Hills. So these were the essential building blocks of Cairo's urban history throughout centuries. And even today, and even from the outer space, one can easily discern between the densely built-up traditional medieval quarters, the completely different urban tissue of the modern districts, the citadel as a still separate unit, and again, the cemeteries forming another entity. Now, one feature that is still clearly recognizable in this city tissue is the bed of the ancient canal along the current day's Bursaid Street. This was a part of an ancient waterway from the late pharaonic times that connected the Nile to the Suez, to the Gulf of Suez, so ultimately the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. We don't know exactly where the mouth of the canal was in ancient times, but in the Roman times, it was in the area where now stands so-called Old Cairo. And the Romans built a mighty fortress to defend the mouth of the canal, one of many that they built in Egypt. They even turned the Luxor temple into a fortress, quite similar to this one. And this fortress can still clearly be seen in the urban tissue of Cairo as the Astes Shama in Old Cairo. You can clearly see the two massive towers that originally guarded the mouth of the canal. You can see a Greek Orthodox church built in the early 20th century on top, in the place of a much older church on top of one of the towers. You can also see another gate to the fortress with two round-fronted big towers, over which in the Middle Ages an important church of Al-Muwalla was built. And by the time of the Arab conquest, there were numerous churches within this fortress and at least one synagogue. Now, the fortress capitulated. It was not taken by storm. So the Arabs, following their ruler's engagement, left the population within the fortress, which remained and still is a mostly Christian district. And they set up initially a military camp, which very quickly grew into a thriving city to the north of it. And like all early Islamic cities, it was centered on a huge congregational mosque, which should be capable of accommodating the whole population of the city. And the mosque is still there, the mosque of Amr ibn al-As. As the city grew rapidly, it was enlarged from a small affair many times and then rebuilt again and again, but it already acquired its overall design and its present size in the year 827. Of the city of Fustat itself, nothing remains except poorly preserved ruins in excavations. And these excavations revealed an extremely irregular, organically growing street pattern within the city without any overall planning, apparently. However, within these very irregular lots, there were very formally, very well-designed houses with square courtyards, rectangular courtyards, with elaborate waterworks. Please notice an arrangement where you have a regular courtyard and two annexes opening onto it from the sides. You will see more of it. And the findings from the city attest that it was a wealthy, important center, trade center, and also a place where people could live their life in luxury. The contemporary travelers marveled at houses of Fustat that could house up to 200 people on 7 floors with running water, quite extraordinary. At the same time, they complained about noise and pollution in the city. So apparently some things never change in Cairo. Now, year 750 was a portentous one for Islamic history. When the Caliphate passed from the Umayyad dynasty to the Abbasids moved their capital from Damascus in Syria to present-day Iraq. First in the new city of Baghdad, then for a time to Samarra. These are the ruins of the great mosque in Samarra. Out of Ayyubid Baghdad, nothing remains. And this shift of the center of gravity of the Islamic world towards the east brought it into a much closer contact with the great Persian civilization and a step away from the Mediterranean late antique tradition. When you compare this piece of architectural decoration from an Umayyad period palace in Khirbat, Armenia, in Palestine, now in the Pergamon Museum, when you compare it with architectural decoration from late antiquity, from Palmyra in this case, you can clearly see that we are within the same overall Mediterranean late antique tradition. In comparison, the frescoes from Samarra, also in the Pergamon Museum now, with their abstract treatment of geometric forms, clearly belong to a completely different aesthetics. The Umayyads founded their own city north of Fustat, north of the previous settlement. It was reported to be regularly planned with a regular street grid, reflecting the centralized, militarized order of the Ayyubid, of the Umayyad Caliphate. But we cannot confirm these reports because nothing remains of the city nowadays. Now, within this huge Umayyad empire, provinces started to show separatist tendencies, and Egypt was no exception. By the late 9th century, a local governor, who was himself from Iraq, became virtually independent of the Caliph, made his own economic and political decision, and minted his own money. Here is his name on his golden dinar, Ahmad ibn Tulun. And Ahmad ibn Tulun built yet another city, again north from the previous settlements, called Al-Qatai, again around a great congregational mosque. He supplied it with water from Birkat al-Khabas to the south. This is how we can imagine Al-Qatai, a completely new city with a great congregational mosque in the center, with the main street leading towards an open parade ground, and between this parade ground and Mukhatam Hills, the palace of the ruler. There was also a Bimaristan, or a hospital, farther to the north, to the south. So this was a completely new city. One thing one may notice is that apparently there was no overall regular planning, differently from what was happening in Iraq at the same time. The Umayyad palaces in Iraq are extremely regular, extremely symmetrical. According to Dr. Tariq Swedin, an authority of Ibn Tulun and his city, this was not the case in Al-Qatai. However, the great congregational mosque of Ibn Tulun is extremely regularly planned. It is essentially preserved in its original form, although it was rebuilt and restored many times. It is still there. You may notice the similarity of the minaret, even though it's been refaced and remodeled to its original model in Samarra. Now, except for the mosque and very scarce remnants of the aqueduct, nothing remains of Al-Qatai. However, this great parade ground, the hippodrome, is still recognizable in the city structure. It remained an open space throughout the city's history. It was seated underneath the citadel, which was built on the site of the previous Tulunid Palace, and it is still clearly visible in the city structure as different from its surrounding. As I speak, it is now one giant construction site. We will see what happens to it, what will come out of it. Now, when Ayyubids took control in year 905, not much changed. It was business as usual. But when the next dynasty replaced them, the Fatimids, the changes were quite profound, to the extent that they affected the design of coinage that had been unchanged for centuries. Now, the Fatimids were an Ismaili Shia who originating in North Africa, who around year 960 started to move east with the objective of taking Baghdad and overthrowing the Sunni Caliph there and replacing him with their own Shia Caliphate. They conquered Egypt in 969, and again, they founded a new urban unit north of the previous ones, called Al-Qahira, from which the modern name Cairo derives. A rectangle of defensive walls on the bank, along the bank of the canal. As the port at the end of the canal was no longer usable, a new harbor called MASQ developed on the Nile. I wanted to say that initially Al-Qahira was just a military encampment, but in year 973, it became the palatial capital city when the Caliph arrived from North Africa, from Tunisia, with his court. He entered the city on the 2nd of Ramadan, 362, around the Hijri, that is 673, and he entered at night, on a Thursday night, and entered the city that was brightly illuminated to receive him. And after more than 100 years, this is still celebrated. But every Ramadan, Cairo is illuminated with thousands of famous Ramadan lamps. The findings from the city show great wealth, opulence, life of luxury, and great artistic refinement. As the goal of conquering Baghdad became clearly unfeasible, the Fatimids turned their attention to protecting their own city. They replaced the earlier mud brick fortifications with mighty stone city walls, big parts of which, including 3 enormous city gates, still survive. In Arabic, Cairo is still always referred to as Al-Qahira al-Mahrusa, Cairo the Protected. The Fatimids developed their own architectural tradition back in North Africa. Their original mosque, congregational mosque in Al-Mahdiya in Tunisia, is preserved. And you can see that elements of this architectural style are portals put in massive salients and the central nave of the sanctuary raised above the roof, basilica style. Both these features are clearly visible in this enormous mosque of Khalif al-Hakim by the northern walls of Cairo, built between 990 and 1013. They can also be seen in the main congregational mosque of Al-Qahira, Al-Azhar, which has been a teaching institution for more than 1,000 years now. Although it has been rebuilt and added to many times, you can also see the same elements with this basilican type raised sanctuary. The Fatimids built this giant congregational mosques, but they also started funding much smaller mosques on a smaller scale, intending to serve local communities rather than the whole population. This is Al-Akbar of 1125. It illustrates well the richness and variety of Fatimid architecture. It was a period of great experimentation and innovation, and many forms, architectural forms that were then adapted and used for centuries and centuries in Cairo actually originate in the Fatimid period. The Fatimids, for whom propagation of the Shia doctrine was very important, dotted the city with sanctuaries of people, important saintly people, important for the Shia teachings. Many of them were actually women from the Prophet's family. These shrines are marked here with the squares with crescents. This one, for instance, on the top of the Muqattam hill, has the form of the mashhad, another typically Fatimid architectural creation, which was a prayer hall attached to a tomb of a saintly person. There are a few preserved, and even though this one has been rather heavy-handedly restored by the Ismaili Bohra sect, for whom the Fatimid monuments are of extreme importance spiritually, they are still captivating works of architecture that very skillfully combine enclosed, open, and semi-enclosed spaces. And the veneration of these shrines remained in place after Egypt reverted to the Sunni Islam. Some, such as this one of Sayyidah Zainab, are so venerated and so popular that they grew enormously. Now it's a huge, huge mosque, which is essentially a modern building in this historic costume, but it is still extremely venerated, and it draws enormous crowds every year on religious festivals. Now, the Fatimid rule in Egypt coincided with the First and the Second Crusade and the funding of the Crusader states in the Middle East. Now, Jerusalem was recaptured in 1187 by Salah ad-Din, known in Europe as Saladin. And to be able to deal with the Crusaders, he first conquered Egypt in 1171. And he established a dynasty of his descendants, the Ayyubids. They built a citadel over the city on the spur of the Muqattam hills, and they embarked on an extremely ambitious project of joining all the different units of Cairo within single enormous chain of fortifications. An extremely ambitious project that was never finished, but long stretches of these walls are still preserved. The citadel is still there. It was added to and rebuilt many times. This is the oldest part. The small round towers are from the times of Salah ad-Din. The bigger round towers are from the times of his nephew, Sultan al-Kamil. As I said, long stretches of the Ayyubid walls are still preserved, like this one in Darrasa, and a restored part of these walls can be seen from the Al-Azhar Park. Now, this man, as the text explains, is Hulagu Khan, whose Mongol armies in the mid-13th century wrought havoc and conquered and destroyed the eastern possessions of the Muslim lands. The panther, here on a relief in one of buildings in Cairo, is the emblem of Baybars, a Mamluk warrior who was crucial in stopping the Mongol invasion in the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. He was soon to become the Sultan in a new line of Egyptian rulers who had recently replaced the Ayyubids. and he ruled as Sultan az-Zahir Baybars, and then he lived for centuries as a hero of the folk popular epics. Now, the Mongol invasion brought widespread destruction to the eastern lands of Islam, as envisaged here by the Russian Orientalist painting Vasily Vereshchagin. This including the sack and destruction of Baghdad and killing of the Caliph and his family. Thanks to al-Baybars and the Mamluk army, this fate was, Cairo spared this fate and could instead become a preeminent intellectual, learning, cultural, and commercial center of the Islamic world. The Mamluk Sultan ruled from Cairo, from the citadel of Cairo, over a regional power that comprised Egypt, Nubia, Syria, with Lebanon and Palestine, and the Hijaz. So he was ruling from Cairo over a dominion that included the three holiest cities of Islam, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. And in these circumstances, the city could develop a very distinct architectural and artistic style in different materials, in different techniques, but very consistent stylistically and of outstanding quality. All the details on this composite image come from one single mosque in Cairo from the mid-14th century, not particularly big mosque and not even funded by the ruling sultan. So this was really a period of cultural flourishing. And Mamluk period architecture still, to a large extent, defines the silhouette, the character of historic city in Cairo. Its domes and its minarets, both in their original form and in their different later reincarnations, still are the signature mark of Cairo. This is how Mamluk Cairo was structured. You can see that the receding Nile left a huge swath of new land, which was taken by fields and gardens and sandbanks. The city expanded it's still centered on Fatimid al-Qahira, but it expanded both north and south. The old Cairo, Fustat, is a completely different entity, and in between it and the settlement farther north, there's nothing. As Al-Maqs harbor became unusable, as the Nile retreated, a completely different entity, a port of Bulaq, was established. You can also see a development on the Rhoda Island when Baybars built a huge citadel to house the Mamluks. It was then abandoned in the 14th century and the Mamluks transferred to the citadel. And you can also notice that the cemeteries were developed farther and farther, and the northern cemetery was developed where we are now. In Al-Qahira, as the seat of power moved to the citadel, the site of previous palaces of the Fatimids quickly filled in with numerous religious and public buildings funded by Mamluk dignitaries and sultans. This is the same area on a map. You can see how crowded it is with these new foundations and how most of them use the plan of what's called a cruciform madrasa, a central courtyard on which open annexes, a type of plan that originated in ancient Persia and proved to be so flexible and so useful that it was used almost universally in mosque architecture, but also in many other types of buildings. This is the main street, the main artery of Al-Qahira, Al-Qasaba, which, as we see it now, essentially took its form in the Mamluk times. The city had a number of such main thoroughfares, which were not very wide by our modern standards at all, but certainly wide enough for two loaded camels to pass. Two such important thoroughfares. the Kasaba horizontal on the map, and Darb al-Ahmar vertical on the map. At crossing at Bab Zuwayla, one of the Fatimid city gates, on top of which Mamluk Sultan al-Mu'ayyad Sheikh built his two towering minarets. This is the view from the gate on this thoroughfare. Now, from these main street thoroughfares branched off sets of dead-end alleyways, each of them being a separate urban unit, but also a separate legal and social entity. At night, these streets would be closed by gates, so at night Cairo would disintegrate into 1,000 villages. Very few of these gates are preserved, but some are, like this one. And to a large extent, this pattern of small, often dead-ended streets, narrow, providing shadow, is still preserved and alive in the historic parts of Cairo, both architecturally and socially, and I dare say that it was, as a way of life, also transported to more modern districts. So these medieval patterns of the hara, of the small dead-end streets, still define the character of historic city. This may look very chaotic, but in fact there is solid urban logic behind this plan. Mamluk planners could also think on a much larger scale, usually earlier than their counterparts in Europe. This is another thoroughfare, the Saliba, where you can see these two almost twin, almost identical minarets, clearly intended to frame the street view, because they belong to two different buildings built by the same patron, but not at the same time. And they only make sense together as framing the view of the street. They don't figure prominently in either of the buildings. The magnificent portal of the great mosque of Sultan Hassan of the second half of the 14th century is set at the end of the facade and at an angle, which might seem awkward unless you realize that it made it visible from the courtyard of the Sultan's palace of the citadel. So again, I believe we have an example of planning on a huge urban scale. The palaces of the sultans at the citadel are long gone now, but the view is still there. Now, this is not a map in our modern sense, but this woodcut illustrates quite well the main features of the city at the end of the Mamluk period. You see the very closely built up city. You see the old Cairo, Babylonia, and Bulaq as separate entities. You see the cemeteries in the desert beyond the city. You see the city walls, but not at the edge of the city, but within it. And you also see canals and seasonal lakes featuring prominently. These lakes were fed with water by the canal in the times of the Nile inundation, and by closing the dike on the canal, the water was kept in them for 8 months every year. On this woodcut, you can even see people swimming in what was then Esbekia Lake, not very clearly visible in this rendering, but very clear in a slightly later French copy of the same original. Now, the original, after which this was copied, was produced in 1549 in Italy, but it pretended to show the events of year 1517. It shows the Mamluk Sultan army retreating and the Turkish troops advancing. And as Egypt changed its political status, became just a province in the Ottoman Empire, the changes to the layout of the citadel illustrate very well the new dynamics of power. The Ottoman governor resided in the southern enclosure of the citadel, where the Mamluk Sultan's palaces were, while the northern enclosure was the quarters of the elite corps of the Ottoman garrison, the Janissaries, who were called Mostahfizan in Cairo. Now, very soon, the Janissaries built a mighty strong wall between the two parts of the citadels, effectively turning their northern enclosure into a citadel of their own, into a fortress of their own, with the guns on the tower traded onto the Ottoman governor's palace. So the governor could only exercise any real power by allying with one fraction of the local Mamluk warlords against the another. And the same was true of his opponents in the garrison. And the local warlords were able to exploit this situation so skillfully that by the 18th century, all real power was effectively in the hands of the local Mamluk base. The Ottomans also turned the area beyond the citadel, under the citadel where the Mamluk stables were, into the lower enclosure of the citadel. You might notice how, still in the late 18th century, the form of the gate is virtually the same as in the Roman fortresses in Egypt and in the Fatimid city walls, even though it didn't make much sense militarily any longer. And then, as the Ottoman garrison assimilated with the local population, the citadel, especially its northern enclosure, turned effectively into just another district in the city. The shores of these seasonal lakes became fashionable locations for the residences of the wealthy, which was a process that began already in the late Mamluk times. Cairo was no longer a capital, but it was a wealthy and important city, and sumptuous buildings were still being erected. This particular one is funded by the reigning Ottoman Sultan, who just wanted to remind his Egyptian subjects about his overlord rule, because the local dignitaries would show their wealth and influence by funding equally important and equally sumptuous buildings, and this competition continued. Architecturally, Cairo remained very much within the Mamluk tradition. You can see a direct continuation of the type of building that you already saw in Fustat, with annexes opening on the central space. And this was a very rich and also multicultural and colorful city, where the architecture followed generally Mamluk tradition, and statistically speaking, numerically speaking, the Ottoman period buildings form the most of the Cairo's architectural historic resource, although they are often underappreciated. Now, this is how Cairo looked at the very end of the Ottoman era on a map surveyed by the surveyors of Napoleon Bonaparte. You can see the same elements that you've already seen. You have Old Cairo and Bulaq as completely separate entities. You have the main city essentially confined to its Mamluk period border without any significant expansion. You see the citadel essentially incorporated into the city. You see the open space in the place of Ibn Tulun Hippodrome. And you also see the seasonal lakes and canals featuring prominently in the cityscape. Now, the French invasion by Napoleon Bonaparte was just an episode in Egypt's history, but it led to important changes. Muhammad Ali, the self-made man who appeared as a ruler in the power vacuum after the French and then British withdrew, was able to consolidate his power, mostly within his own family, to get rid of the Mamluk menace by massacring the Mamluk base at the citadel in 1811, and established a dynasty that ruled over Egypt until year 1952. Till year 1914, nominally as part of the Ottoman Empire, but de facto independent. Muhammad Ali's grandson, shown here at the opening ceremony of the Suez Canal, famously said, "My country is no longer in Africa, it is now in Europe." And he embarked on a very ambitious program of modernization and Europeization. And the Suez Canal was emblematic of this program of reforms and modernization. Khedive Ismail also bankrupted his country in the process, leading to a direct rule by foreign powers, although Egypt was never declared a colony. Now, Khedive Ismail's reforms had direct impact on Cairo, on the development of Cairo. As a young man in his youth, he was sent to Paris for schooling. Then later, before he became the Khedive in 1863, he was sent to Paris on diplomatic missions. So he could see with his own eyes, he could witness how Paris transformed from a medieval city of narrow, winding streets where raw sewage was flowing in the open gutters into the city we know now, the Paris of wide boulevards, splendid parks, gorgeous buildings. He wanted to see Cairo transformed in a similar way. The difference was that unlike Baron Haussmann in Paris, Ismail didn't need to resort to large-scale demolitions to create his new city, because he had at his disposal the newly acquired land where the Nile retreated. So the new center of Cairo, the modern downtown Cairo, the Ismailia district, was largely built on this fresh land and filled in lakes. So the historic Cairo, the old districts, were largely left behind and left to their own devices. Downtown Cairo strove to be a European city, and with remarkable success. It could be light years away from the narrow lanes of historic Cairo, so nearby. One of the results was that prime land in Cairo, downtown Cairo, by the end of the 19th century was as expensive as in Paris or in Brussels. One of the results was that a Belgian entrepreneur, Edouard Empin, soon Baron Empin, in partnership with Noubar Pasha, formed a company that bought 25 square kilometers of desert northeast of Cairo to build a satellite city there. This 25 square kilometers was about as much as the whole city of Cairo at the time. This new city, Heliopolis, followed the newest trends in urban planning in Europe at the time. The analogies between the original garden city of Letchworth and Heliopolis are very clear. And also it was very modern in technical terms. All these buildings under the neo-Mamluk, neo-Moorish costume have in fact reinforced concrete ceilings, probably much earlier than any residential building in Europe. It was typical of Empire, who made his fortune on new technologies, that he wanted this to be a modern city. He invested in transportation, in electric trams, in services, in water from artesian wells, in various services, schooling, post office, first aid station. There was even an aerodrome already well before World War I, just a few years after the first flight of the Wright brothers. These grand palatial-looking buildings on Heliopolis' main boulevards are the city's showcase and most catch the eye, of course. But Heliopolis was never meant to be a dormitory suburb. It was meant to be a real city, providing work and home for people from very different social strata. So it had a wide variety of very different buildings. And at the bottom end, the accommodations in the area designed to house the families of Nubian doorkeepers were extremely basic accommodations. But each family had its own units with a courtyard, so well lit and well ventilated, with electricity, with running water, with their own toilet, which is quite remarkable compared to the standards of living in poor districts of the European cities before World War I. Now, the development of Cairo in the second half of the 20s and in the 21st century is determined by the population explosion and the resulting expansion, ever faster, never stopping expansion, both numerically and territorially on a grand scale. Sometimes happening in a planned, organized way, sometimes by uncontrolled growth of informal housing. And the scale of this development is astonishing, of this expansion. This is Manhattan to the same scale. This is the whole New York City to the same scale, the 5 boroughs of New York City. So, of course, running a megalopolis of such scale, of such size, poses tremendous challenges, especially as far as infrastructure is concerned. For instance, hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of kilometers of new roads have to be built. And this is where the needs of modern development can come in direct conflict with the needs of historic preservation. This is the area of the Southern Cemetery in August 2019. This is how it looks 5 years later. So you can see both the orange lines are the limits of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the purple lines of its buffer zone. So we can see both the scale and the pace of this development. And you can also see entire historic traditional districts wiped out, disappearing. So to sum up, what does the future hold for Cairo? I don't think there is a simple answer to this. Throughout almost 1400 years of its history, Cairo has reinvented and redefined itself many times, often turning its back to its own past. Even the idea of establishing a new administrative capital away from the existing city is nothing new in Cairo. So in 200, 300, 500 years, we will not be here, and neither will be our great-grandchildren, but Cairo will. It will be a very different city from the one we know now, but I am personally convinced that the mother of the world, the Cairo the protected, will remain the city victorious. Thank you very much. If I may, I would also like to add that this gorgeous picture was taken by our dear late friend John Finney. The equally glorious initial picture was taken by Agnieszka Dobrowolska. Most of the aerial photography was taken by Rajan Patel. Many of other photographs were taken by photographers who at the time worked for the Egyptian Antiquities Project of the American Research Center, a grand conservation enterprise, Patrick Godot and Mariusz Kaczycznik. And black and white maps were produced by Dr. Nicholas Warner for the same project. We use all this material fully legally, but I think it would be unfair not to mention, not to credit the authors. Thank you.